Okay, we are recording.
Okay, all right, great. And everyone's here? We admitted the participants?
Yeah, we have 27 people, including us.
Great, great. Well, welcome everybody. So glad you could make it to our Weeds to Watch For webinar. As Amy said, we're going to be recording the webinar, so you can watch it later. And if you you want to share it with a colleague or someone who wasn't able to be here, we'll be able to share the link after the presentation. And so we are recording, as she mentioned. We were hoping folks could use the chat feature during this presentation. So you should be on mute, but if you have any questions or comments, feel free to type them in the chat, and we'll try to answer some questions as we go. And then also we'll have some time at the end for questions as well. And we did want to ask folks if they could type in the chat where they're from, what organization or area of the state they're from. Okay, so my name's Mary Walsh, and I'm with the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program. Our other presenters will introduce themselves in a moment. But from 1 to 2 today, we're going to be talking we're going to be going through our presentation about what are invasive species and which ones we're particularly interested in looking out for, as well as some information about how to mitigate and prevent them. We do have a lot of material to go through, so we're going to save our questions for the very end. At around 2, we'll have some time for question and answers. Yeah, as I mentioned, I'm Mary, and I'm an aquatic zoology coordinator and aquatic ecologist with the program at the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. My involvement in invasive species has to do with managing some projects for invasive species control, as well as doing tracking of invasive species with the IMAP Invasives program. Tom, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for showing up today. My name is Tom Cermak. I'm a coastal outreach specialist with Pennsylvania Sea Grant and the local coordinator of the Lake Erie Watershed Cooperative Weed Management Area. I've been in this role since 2012.
Amy?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Amy Jewett, and I am one of the main coordinators of the IMAP Invasives program for Pennsylvania. I've been in this role since 2013, and Mary and I work very closely together doing administrative duties for IMAP. So for those of you that know me already through that role, you're probably very familiar with the program, so welcome.
Pete.
Hi, I'm Pete Woods. I am an inventory ecologist with the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program. And I do a lot of surveys for rare plants and animals all across Western Pennsylvania. And also sometimes for invasive species, especially up in the Erie watershed of Pennsylvania.
And Jeff Wagner, the program director for the Natural Heritage Program, is also here. He's going to be manning the chat. Jeff, do you want to introduce yourself? Maybe he's on mute. Okay. Well,
sorry, Jeff Wagner, Director of Natural Heritage Program at Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. And indeed, I will be watching the chat. So if you have any questions, type in there, I'll try to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Okay, well, we'll get started. Just giving a little bit of background here. For the purposes of the webinar, we'll be using the words weed and invasive species interchangeably. And so in this context, we mean that invasive species are those transplanted, can be intentionally or sometimes accidentally from another region. And those species impact our natural resources, economy, and human health. When they're transplanted to a new place, you know, from one region of North America to another, or from, you know, around the continents, they will have a lack of predators and diseases in their new home, and then can have explosive population growth and be easily spread. Of course, native plants can also be invasive, but for this webinar, we're going to be talking about ones that are invasive non-natives. So kudzu, as you can see in that photo, is just one example of an invasive vine that can grow over trees, and that's a particularly bad example. And in that photo, you can see how it would be very damaging to trees when it grows over them in that form. Of course, there's a number of other examples of invasives doing similar things. In this photo on the right, you see knotweed taking over stream banks, where it really outcompetes the native plants and reduces the habitat, really altering it from its natural state. Other invasive species are known to alter soils, changing the carbon and nitrogen composition or the microbes. Aquatic invasives are notorious for altering the dissolved oxygen, for example. Other plants, we know can be sort of nasty for other reasons. Giant hogweed occurs in Pennsylvania and, can be hazardous to the touch and to, if you get in your eyes, it can cause some problems. So there's a number of different reasons that we care about weeds. And of course, catching them early is better than later. We know that we can, if we prevent invasive species, the cost is much lower than trying to treat something that's a raging out of control infestation. And as time goes on, invasive species management gets more and more expensive, and it becomes less likely that you will actually be able to contain an invasion. So, and some of the reasons that invasive species are particularly, problematic is that it can take years to deplete seed banks, and once an infestation is controlled, it can take a long time to monitor and ensure that regrowth isn't occurring, and if it is, to keep retreating it. And of course, that adds up to tons of money. This estimate from Presque Isle State Park is, $84,000 a year in staff time and materials and the cost to travel around the park. So obviously the costs can get quite steep. So here I'm gonna leave it off, and Pete Woods is gonna take the reins here and talk about some invasive species.
Thanks, Mary. I'm going to start by talking about garlic mustard. It's a very timely weed to be talking about right now because garlic mustard pulling season has just started here in Pittsburgh this week. And so within the next couple weeks, it'll probably be that season up in the northern part of the state. So garlic mustard, if you're not familiar with it, it's a biennial. It lives for 2 years. In the first year, it grows as a rosette of leaves, like in the photos here. And you can recognize it because the leaves are, they're sort of heart-shaped, but kind of rounded at the tip. And they have these kind of rounded teeth all around the outside. Next slide. So that's what it looks like in the first year. In the second year, it puts up a flower stalk, and that's what it's doing this week. Those flower stalks are just shooting up. And then that stalk gets leaves alternating on different sizes. And those leaves are a little bit more pointier, with a little bit more toothier than the rosette leaves. And next slide. And if you look at the flowers, they all have 4 petals. This is a member of the mustard family. So like everything else in that family, it has those 4 petals. And it also, pretty quickly after the flowers disappear, they grow, what's left grows into these long cylindrical seed pods. that will eventually shatter and drop their seeds all over. So you want to control this plant before those seed pods shatter. Next slide. Next slide, Mary.
Taking a moment to advance, so just bear with me.
So when garlic mustard is left uncontrolled, it grows really thickly, and it pretty much excludes everything else, at least all other non-woody plants. And one way it's able to do that is because it produces chemicals that inhibit the growth of other plants. And specifically, these chemicals kill the fungi that are mycorrhizally associated with the roots of other plants. Garlic mustard itself isn't a mycorrhizal species, so it doesn't rely on these fungi. So it poisons the fungi of other plants, and that gives it a competitive edge. Next slide. For controlling garlic mustard, when it sends up that shoot of flowers, that stalk, in its second year, that's the time you want to pull it. You could control it the first year, that one, yeah. But the little seedlings and the young rosettes there are so many of them, and they're so small that it takes a long time to pull them. If you just leave those alone for the first year, most of them will die off. They compete with each other and smother each other out. And what's left in that second spring, it's more efficient to wait until then to pull them. But you have to remember that the seed development will continue even after you pull the plant. So most people recommend bagging the plants and then throwing them in the trash. When I'm working on a patch of garlic mustard in my local park here, and I dump the plants in the same spot, one big pile of plants every year, and they pretty much disappear. And I don't know if they're not dropping seeds or if the seeds get smothered under there, or if I put it in the same spot every year and always go back the next year to make sure I kill anything that does sprout from that pile. That just saves some time, saves some carrying around of bags, saves some plastic. If you are sort of limited for person power, you could also use herbicides. It's probably a little more efficient to walk around with a backpack sprayer and just kind of spray those rosettes rather than to bend over and pull every one. But what you have to remember is that whatever control method you want to use, you have to keep at it for quite a while, because garlic mustard is a good seed banker. Those seeds will remain viable in the soil, often up to 10 years. So you have to come back year after year. But after the first 2 years, the density of the garlic mustard will dramatically decline, because most of the seeds sprout within a year or two. So it gets manageable within a couple of years. Okay, next slide. There are some look-alike plants that look sort of like garlic mustard. Okay, here's a question. Don't the herbicides hurt our pollinators? Yes, they might. Glyphosate, which is the most commonly used herbicide, it only affects plants and some bacteria, but some bees have bacteria in their guts. And so that's a possible issue for some bees. However, if those bees have their obligate host plants smothered by the garlic mustard, that's also a definite impact on them. So you have to balance out the risks and benefits. And it is possible to control garlic mustard without using the chemicals. That's true. Violets look vaguely like garlic mustard. They're a little more pointy at the leaf tip, and if it's not in flower, you might mix them up. And there are other plants that have kind of heart-shaped leaves like that. But once that flower stalk comes up, there's not a lot that looks like garlic mustard. One related plant is the dame's rocket, this flower on the right here. This is also in the mustard family. It's also invasive, and it has a biennial life history very much like garlic mustard, and it's vulnerable to the same control methods. So while you're out there pulling garlic mustard, keep an eye out for this. There's also a pink and a purple form of the flower. They can be either of those colors. Usually the colors are mixed together in a population. So pull that one too. It's very pretty, but it is also very invasive. Next slide. Garlic mustard has spread all over the Northeast. On the left, you can see the continental distribution. Those pink and light blue squares are the counties where it occurs. And on the right side is the Pennsylvania county distribution from IMAP invasives. And you can see it's pretty much everywhere in Pennsylvania now. And it's not one of these early detection species for sure. It's out there. That cat's out of the bag, but you can still keep it out of places where it hasn't really taken over yet. And you can control even bad infestations within limited areas if you put the effort into it. Okay, next slide. Phragmites. The common name for this one is you'll often see it written as common reed. I don't know anyone who uses that name though. Everyone calls it Phragmites, which is the genus name. And we're talking about Phragmites australis, and specifically the invasive subspecies australis. We actually do have a native subspecies of Phragmites, and it is in just a couple places in Pennsylvania. You're not likely to see it. It's a little bit tricky to identify. If you have any doubts about what you have, you can call us. But all the occurrences we know about are in Erie County, and there are only a couple of them. So if you see Phragmites, you're probably safe, assuming it's the invasive subspecies. This is a grass, and I like to, there's several large invasive grasses, and I like to divide them into wetland and upland grasses, and taller than you grasses and shorter than you grasses. This one is almost always in a wetland, and it's almost always taller than you when it's mature. I've seen it up to like 14 feet tall. It's really a big plant. Next slide. And one way you can recognize it is to look for those leaves that are coming off from the stem at an angle. And you can look for the big plumes up on top. They're kind of distinctive. Next slide. Phragmites grows really fast, and it grows in a thick monoculture. It excludes just about everything else. And on the one picture, you can see how big those rhizomes are. They're like as big as your finger, and they'll grow out like 5–10 feet out underground, and then they'll pop up new shoots and they'll pump nutrients into those shoots. So the patch is able to spread really quickly that way. Next slide. There are a few plants that look a little bit like it. This is pampas grass, cordaria. And actually this is sort of an old specimen at the end of winter. The seed plumes are actually usually bigger than that, and they look a little bit more like Phragmites. But this plant is strictly an upland plant. And when it's mature, it's always going to be taller than you. It's like 8, 10, 12 feet tall. Next slide. Another large invasive grass that you might confuse with it is Chinese silvergrass, or miscanthus. It's also an upland plant. This one is shorter than you, almost always, except for sometimes really healthy ones might be taller than a person. It's strongly clump forming, and it has these curled over, the seed heads have this curled over look that's different than Phragmites. So both of those other ones I showed you, they are invasive. Basically any really large grass in Pennsylvania that's like almost as tall as you or higher is going to be invasive. Next slide. And there are some other grasses that look vaguely like it, like this is reed canary grass. I think immature Phragmites might be confused with reed canary grass, but this one grows in a wetland, and it's a lot shorter than Phragmites. It's actually a native one, but it grows in weedy situations. So it's often found in the same places that Phragmites is found in. Next slide. So Phragmites it's not everywhere in Pennsylvania, but it's widespread in a few corners, especially the northwest part of the state. The large wetlands that are up there in the glaciated corner of the state are easily taken over by Phragmites. There's a lot of it up there, but you can also see it's gotten around to a lot of other corners of the state too. Okay, next slide. Purple loosestrife is an invasive plant. It's from Europe. It always grows, almost always grows in wetlands. You also see it in roadside ditches, anywhere that's wet enough for it to be happy. It produces many little tiny seeds, and they spread around in flowing water or in floating in water. Used to spread around by the horticultural industry. It was brought over probably as an ornamental, and it's a very beautiful plant, but it spreads and gets really out of control and excludes like everything else. It's now a Class B noxious weed in Pennsylvania, so they're not supposed to sell it, but the horticultural trade they have put out cultivars of it that they claim are sterile, and the problem with that is that sometimes, even though they're sterile with themselves, they can cross with each other and produce viable seeds that then get out into the world and start causing problems there. Next slide. There are so purple loosestrife has square stems, and it has pairs of leaves, and the pairs of leaves alternate in direction. So like if one pair is north-south, the next pair above it or below it is going to be pointing east and west. And it has this big terminal spike of bright purple flowers. And it's pretty distinctive. There aren't too many plants that have a spike of flowers like that. It's not a woody plant, it's herbaceous, but the stems are kind of persistent. They'll last at least through the winter, the old dead ones. Next slide. There are a few other plants that look kind of like it. One is blue vervain. I wouldn't have thought this would be a loosestrife lookalike, but I've heard about crews of people who were sent out to kill stands of blue vervain, thinking that it was purple loosestrife. The flowers on this one are much smaller. The teeth, or the leaves are, they have teeth and they have lobes, unlike purple loosestrife, which has a smooth margin on the leaf. Next slide. There is a native loosestrife that looks a bit like it, but the easiest difference to see is that the flowers are spaced out along the whole stem of the native winged loosestrife, whereas in the purple loosestrife, their flowers are limited to a big spike at the tip of the stem. And the winged loosestrife is a much smaller plant, and it mostly grows in the southeast part of the state. And it's rare in Pennsylvania. You're not likely to see it too many places. Next slide. Okay, so purple loosestrife, this is another one where it's really out of the bag, and it's all across Pennsylvania. Often you don't see as much purple loosestrife in some places as you did a couple decades ago, because there was an effort to release two species of beetle that eat only purple loosestrife, and they've been spread around. I've only seen them in a couple places in Pennsylvania, but they've been released in some of the worst infestations, and they've done a pretty good job of taking care of it, but they don't always do it. So sometimes purple loosestrife can still be a problematic plant in some situations. So you may have to go in there and use a different control method, such as digging it out or using herbicides. Okay, next. Japanese stilt grass. So a lot of people think grasses in general are really hard to identify, at least the small ones. But this one is one that I guarantee you can identify. If you just remember one thing about Japanese steelgrass, it's that down the center of the leaf, there is a shiny, reflective, silvery stripe. And there's no other plant, no other grass that has that stripe down the middle of the leaf. It's actually a little bit off center, which is kind of odd because most grass leaves are very bilaterally symmetric. This one is, it's a little bit asymmetric. This is an annual grass. So it dies back every year and grows from seed in the spring. And it's usually shorter than your knees. And when it gets taller, it starts flopping over, and then it roots at the nodes and then continues growing from there. Next slide. You can also learn to identify it at other stages in its life. These are the seedlings, and you can see they do not have the stripe. So it's a little harder to recognize. They start out, the first leaf is it's not quite round, but it's rounder. And then each subsequent leaf gets longer and pointier. And also you can see the old thatch underneath these seedlings. That's the grass stems from last year. Next slide. When the plants get a little bit bigger, each leaf gets bigger until after 4 or 5 leaves, they're getting to be full sized, and they start to get that yellow, or that shiny stripe visible. Next. When the plant gets older, it gets a little bit, it stretches out more, there's more space between the leaves, and then eventually it flowers and produces these straight spikelets of seeds. And that's in the fall. So around probably I think it's late September when those start to shatter. And when that happens, I'm afraid to even walk through a patch of steelgrass because I know I'm going to be carrying seeds out because they fall everywhere and get stuck in your boots. Next slide. And even in the winter, you can learn to recognize this plant because the thatch is left, especially where it's climbed up on top of other plants. It just kind of gets stuck there and hangs up there. And it's this light tan color. You can see it all winter. Another common name for the plant is packing grass. That's actually how it got here. It came from Asia, and it was used to pack in boxes around whatever items they were shipping. And I guess there must have been viable seeds in there, and that's how they got a start over here. Next. There aren't any other grasses that have that stripe down the leaf. There are some other ones that look vaguely similar, like this picture is bearded shorthusk. You see the leaves are about the same shape, but the plant is more erect and it doesn't have that stripe on the leaf, and it's not rooting at the nodes because it's standing up straight. So you should be able to recognize Japanese steelgrass, at least during the middle of the growing season when it's got that stripe on the leaf. Next. Forward one, that one. So this spreads very quickly. Like in the last 8 years, it has just exploded and completely taken over parts of my local park here, shockingly quickly. It spreads along roads, spreads along streams, it spreads through disturbed forests, especially where logging has happened. Once upon a time, when you logged a forest in Pennsylvania, it would grow back with pretty much the same species, but nowadays, commercial logging often it ends up introducing stiltgrass and barberry, especially if people aren't taking care to wash off the equipment that's going in there. Seeds will be brought in and they will take over in the disturbed soils. Japanese steelgrass tends to prefer moister soils and it tends to prefer limestone, but it has a pretty broad tolerance. This one also seed banks. It's not usually longer than 5 years, so it's not quite as tough as garlic mustard. But if you want to eradicate this, you have to keep after it for probably 5 years. Next slide. So this one has spread rapidly across Pennsylvania in the last couple decades. You can see it's in most counties now, probably in every county actually. Some of these places we just haven't documented it yet. And okay, that's about it for stiltgrass. What's the next slide? Knotweed. Okay, this one is for, this one goes to Amy Jewett. So thank you all.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Okay, so I'll be talking with you guys about knotweed species. So here I'm actually talking about a few species, not just one. Japanese knotweed, giant knotweed, and also Bohemian knotweed. So the scientific name for these is actually, sometimes it can be known by several names, Renoitria species, or Fallopian species, or even sometimes Polygonum species. So I think the one that probably most people are familiar with is Japanese knotweed. But there are a few other kinds, as I mentioned, giant knotweed and also Bohemian knotweed. And Bohemian knotweed is a hybrid between both the Japanese and the giant knotweed. And the identification for these can be a little tricky. So some things to keep in mind as far as how to tell the difference. So if you look at the size of the leaves, generally speaking, the size of the Japanese knotweed leaf will be smaller compared to the giant knotweed and the Bohemian knotweed. The leaves of the giant knotweed and Bohemian knotweed can be up to 1 foot long. So they are significantly larger. But leaf size is not always the best way to tell the difference because it can vary. So another way to tell the difference is if you look at the base of the leaves, close to where it connects to the stem. And on Japanese knotweed, the base of the leaf will be squared. And if you look at the base of the leaf on giant and Bohemian knotweed, it will be rounded or curved. So that's another way that you can tell the difference. Next slide, Mary. So Japanese knotweed and other types of knotweed are known to invade a lot of different areas. It will go into some of the wetter places like wetlands and stream and river corridors, but it also likes drier places too. So forest edges, I'm sure as many of you have been driving along, you probably have seen knotweed along roadsides. It can also be found near railroad tracks and utility right-of-ways, vacant lots, and pretty much any disturbed area where maybe there's been some kind of construction that's happened and then there's some bare soil that's exposed. And if there's sunlight and a little bit of rain, you can almost guarantee that if there's seeds of knotweed nearby or at that location, that it will try to grow there. In Pennsylvania, all 3 species of knotweed are considered Class B noxious weeds. And knotweed was brought to North America originally for a few different uses. It was prized for its use as an ornamental plant in people's gardens, for use as forage, and also for erosion control. But ironically enough, we've come to know that knotweed actually is not very good for controlling erosion, but actually for helping it along. And so if you see, for example, a riparian corridor or a place where there's a stream or a creek, like in this photo here on this slide, the knotweed that's present along the shore of that river is actually helping to loosen the soil. It's not actually helping to stabilize it. And so that can be very problematic. Next slide, please, Mary. So if you look in the photo here in the upper right part of this slide, you can see this entire area has been completely taken over with knotweed. And this is a major ecological problem. There we go. This is a major ecological problem because anytime you have any species, not just knotweed, but in this case, we're talking about knotweed, when you have a monoculture of one species, especially when it's invasive, you are really hurting the natural biodiversity. So both the plants and the animals that live in that area. You know, other native plants are unable to grow there. The knotweed is just very dense and it's not going to allow sunlight to go down into the soil where other seeds of native plants might be trying to grow. And native wildlife really can't use this. They can't use it as a food source. They're not co-evolved. to eat it, and they really can't live in there, again, because it's just so dense. So really, areas like this, it's just such a hardship for natural biodiversity. And also, as far as water quality goes, looking at that same photo there in the top right, if you would have a storm event happen, the soil along the shoreline there, again, is just going to erode into the water, and it's going to go downstream, and it's probably actually going to carry along with it fragments and seeds of the knotweed that's going to establish downstream into other new locations. And so it's harmful in that way, and it helps to promote itself by using the water flow. And knotweed can be very damaging, not just to the natural environment, but also to human infrastructure as well. So if you look at the photos there on the bottom, you can see that the knotweed is incredibly hardy, because not only is it growing through, but up into pavement. And so it has this just incredible ability to be able to grow in such a harsh environment. And so places like near our homes and foundations, as well as roads and bridges, this can be a huge detriment and a big problem. And so management of this species in all of these types of locations is definitely warranted. Next slide, please, Mary. So sometimes there is a little bit of confusion for telling knotweed apart from another species that it may look a little bit similar to, and that is bamboo. But there are some ways that you can tell the difference fairly easily. So if you first look in the middle photo here on the slide, you can see that this is knotweed, and it does lose its foliage during the wintertime, whereas bamboo will have the leaves that it makes year round. So that's one way to tell the difference. Also, if you would cut the stem of a knotweed plant, you will notice that it will appear visibly wet after cutting it. And that's because it's a herbaceous species. If you would cut the stem of bamboo, you would notice that it's a lot more woody, and it's not gonna have that visibly wet look to it like you can see here in the photo on the left for knotweed. Next slide, please. And as far as the distribution for these species, so I wasn't able to provide maps from BONAP just because we're talking about 3 different species, and there wasn't enough screen real estate here to show all the maps that they would be easily viewable. But as far as data that we have available in IMAP invasives, you can see that it is fairly widespread across the state. And my inclination as far as the distribution is to say that it's probably in some of these other counties that we don't have documented occurrences for yet, just because no one there has done the active reporting it, but I'm sure that it probably is a little bit more widespread than we know at this point in time. Next slide, please. Okay, so our next species is mile-a-minute vine. It's also known as devil's tail tear thumb. And this species is known to invade a lot of different places, places that are open and disturbed and receive a lot of sunlight. So places like fields and forest edges, but also along stream banks and wetlands as well, and certainly along roadsides where there is a lot of disturbance. This also is a Class B noxious weed in Pennsylvania, and it gets its name because it is able to grow incredibly rapidly, especially in the peak growing season of the warmer months of the year. It is known to be able to grow up to 6 inches per day, which is just incredible if you think about it. So as you can see in this photo here on the slide, mile-a-minute vine is very capable of producing these incredibly thick tangles of vines. And those vines will then take over other nearby herbaceous and woody vegetation that may be growing there. And also the mile-a-minute vine can also climb up into trees as well. So it can really go into a lot of different places in these natural spaces. And what it does once it's starting to kind of take over these other plants is it will block the sunlight for these other species so that they are unable eventually to even photosynthesize. And once that kind of proliferates and it keeps happening more and more, these plants will eventually die because they're not getting the access to the sunlight that they need. Next slide, please, Mary. So mile-a-minute vine can be spread in a few different ways by animals that may eat the seeds and then take them to other places. It can also, the seeds can fall into water and can go and spread down a creek or a stream or a river, just with the flow of the water. And people also can spread this plant as well. Say you're hiking through an area that may have an infestation of mile-a-minute, and you may have the seeds, get trapped in the crevices on the bottom of your feet or your shoes. And then you keep walking and you go to other places, and maybe you forget to clean your shoes at the end of your hike. You may have just accidentally transported this species and perhaps other things too, not even knowing that that's what just happened, but that's another way that this species can get around. So the stems on mile-a-minute vine are fairly delicate. However, as you can see in both of these pictures, especially the one on the left, it has these really ugly recurved barbs on there. And this is one of the big reasons why, if you do have mile-a-minute vine and you're trying to control it, maybe manually by mechanically pulling it, you do want to make sure you're wearing good leather gloves and something with long sleeves, because this can really tear you up. So you do want to be very careful of those barbs, and they're both on the stem of the plant and also on the underside of the leaf blades. Also, another thing to look for as far as identification for this species is it has, if you look in the photo there on the right, a distinctive circular cup-shaped leafy structure that's called an ochrea that will surround the stem at the nodes. And so if you see that, that's another indication that this species you're looking at may just be mile-a-minute vine. Next slide, please, Mary. Okay, so as far as lookalikes to be aware of, so mile-a-minute vine can sometimes be confused with another one of our native species, halberd-leaved tear thumb. And as you can see in these photos, both of these plants have triangular shaped leaves, more so with mile-a-minute vine, that it's very triangular. The halberd-leaved tear thumb kind of has some curves in the leaves that just make it a little bit more distinctive and not quite like mile-a-minute vine. And also, I believe the berries, I don't know if the halberd-leaved tear thumb produces berries or not. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that the mile-a-minute vine berries are fairly distinctive as well. And also, again, those barbs on the mile-a-minute vine are very, very distinctive. And so that's, these are all things to keep in mind as far as identifying the species. Next slide, please. Okay, as far as distribution for this species in our state, as you can see from both the maps here from the Biota of North America program and IMAP Invasives, it is fairly widespread. About 2/3 of the state, a little, maybe more, a little less, depending on which program you're looking at, but it is fairly widespread. Again, my inclination is to say that it's probably in more places than what we realize, just because it's probably not being as actively reported as we maybe would hope that it would be. So as we're talking about all these species here today during our training, I would just emphasize the importance of reporting your finds, because it's so valuable to then be able to share that information and better understand its distribution when it's documented in a place like either the Biota of North America program or IMAP Invasives. Next slide, please. Okay, and the last species that I'll be talking about with you today is Tree of Heaven. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this one already. One of the reasons why I think Tree of Heaven has kind of gotten a spotlight put on it recently is because of the introduction of spotted lanternfly in Pennsylvania. And that is because one of the favored host trees of spotted lanternfly is Tree of Heaven. So Tree of Heaven is one that really can be found in a lot of different places. It's very capable of surviving in urban and suburban environments, but it's also known to be found in agricultural and forested settings as well. Originally, it was prized as a very unique and fast-growing ornamental tree, again, that was able to withstand a lot of kind of poor site conditions like bad soils and poor air quality, and it also was able to withstand droughts. But over time, people began noticing that this was a really weedy kind of tree. It had prolific root sprouting. And it also, if you break the stems and twigs on Tree of Heaven, you'll notice that it has a very bad smell to it. And so that was not very appealing to a lot of people who may have wanted this as a nice ornamental tree in their yard. In Pennsylvania, tree of heaven is a Class B noxious weed, and it is fairly widely established in Pennsylvania. And unfortunately, as far as management is concerned for this species, it's not really feasible, or at least not easy to eradicate. So this is one that likely, if you have a large infestation of tree of heaven, you're probably going to be looking at more of a control and management over time, not necessarily eradication. Although if you do have a few trees here and there, certainly it's probably very possible to be able to eradicate a smaller number of these. Next slide, please. So as far as identification, so the leaves of tree of heaven are pinnately compound, meaning that they have that one central stem down the middle, and they have leaflets on either side. So the photo there on the bottom, that entire thing is the leaf of tree of heaven, and those individual pieces of it are the leaflets. So this tree and its leaves can have anywhere from 10 to 40 leaflets per leaf. And the base of each leaflet has a small notch on it. So that's one thing to look for as far as identifying it. Also, if you would turn the leaf over and look at the individual leaflets on it, you can see in the upper photo on this slide, I have some pink circles there that are pointing out these protruding glands that the tree has. So that's another thing to look for, again, as far as a distinguishing characteristic for this tree. And again, as I mentioned, tree of heaven has a really foul smell to it if you break the twigs. So some people have compared it to smelling like rancid peanuts or well-used gym socks, neither of which sound very appealing to me. So I definitely recommend, not going there, and try not to smell it if you don't have to. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, just kind of going over some more of these key identifying characteristics for tree of heaven. So it does have smooth leaf edges, as you can see there in the photo on the left. It has the notch at the base of each of the leaflets. Again, you can see that pretty good there in that photo. There's small glands on the underside of the leaflets, large clusters of yellow flowers and tanned or reddish fruit, and these single-winged papery seeds that are called samaras, which you can see there in the photo there on the bottom right. Again, that really foul smell. And also the bark on young trees will be smooth and gray or brown in color. With older and more mature trees, the bark will be a bit rougher and will have these diamond-shaped fissures. And you can sort of see that here in the photo there on the top of this slide. Next slide, please, Mary. So this tree has a lot of problems that it can cause, both ecologically and economic problems as well. So tree of heaven is able to produce these special chemicals that inhibit the growth of other plants that may be trying to grow nearby. And this is called alleopathy. And that is one of its special traits that it has that allows it to not only spread to new locations, but then outcompete the other plants and vegetation that may be trying to grow there. And it's very easy to then form essentially a monoculture of tree of heaven because everything else is dying because of these chemicals that get emitted into the soil. Again, it's able to form these dense monocultures or stands, and that essentially is pushing out the important native plants that were growing there previously that were really important to the wildlife. So any place where there's a lot of tree of heaven growing, again, just like we talked about before with knotweed or even mile and minute vine, your amount of biodiversity and plants and animals that are living there will be decreased because of that. Also, if you look at the photos there on the left and the bottom right, you can see that this plant, this tree, has very aggressive root systems that can grow very close to homes and cause a lot of trouble, not only with home foundations, like you can see here in the lower right photo, but also with other types of infrastructure like sewers and pavement. And so it's really important to try to make sure that if you have tree of heaven growing near your home or other buildings or businesses, that you get rid of it as soon as you can, because it's only gonna probably bring about trouble in the future, unfortunately. Next slide. So there are a few lookalike species that can be similar in appearance to Tree of Heaven. And there are some ways to tell them apart though. So these other species all have compound shaped leaves. Species like sumacs, both staghorn sumac and smooth sumac, which you can see here in the photos on this slide, can be similar. But if you look at the leaves of sumac, they have these teeth, these edges on the sides of the leaves, whereas Tree of Heaven has smooth leaf edges. And also sumac produces these red fruit clusters. Again, you can see that clearly in these photos, and Tree of Heaven does not produce them. So if you see that, that's another clear way to tell the difference. Also, some other species of trees like ash, black walnut, and hickory all have those same kinds of compound shaped leaves. However, walnut and hickory will produce nuts. Tree of Heaven does not. And also the bark of ash is pretty different compared to that of Tree of Heaven. The ash bark has sort of a spongy feel to it. So if you would push your thumb into the ash bark, you'll kind of feel it give a little bit. Whereas the bark of Tree of Heaven is very smooth and it doesn't have that sponginess to it. Next slide, please. Okay, and finally, the distribution for Tree of Heaven, as far as what we know, according to our maps here, it is again fairly widespread in the state. There's only a few places for both the Biodive North America program and IMAP invasives that we don't have records for. But as I've mentioned for the other species, I'm inclined to think that it probably is in more places than what we realize just because of lack of reporting. Okay, and I think that's all I have. I'll give it over to either Mary or Tom at this point.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Amy and Pete, for that great background in invasive species identification. In this portion of the presentation, I'm going to be going over a few action items or best management practices that municipalities can undertake to reduce the spread of invasive plants. The individual items I'll be covering today include mowing, selective herbicide applications, and maintenance of equipment, the disposal of plant and excavated materials, prevention of soil disturbance, and the stabilization of erosion-prone sites, as well as the reestablishment of native vegetation. Next slide, please, Mary. Understanding that mowing is a common maintenance function of municipalities, it is also a great way to proliferate seed and viable invasive plant materials throughout the right-of-way. Many common roadside invasives, as mentioned by Pete and Amy, have the ability to sprout from stem and root fragments. Mowing these plants should be avoided when they are in their viable state whenever possible. If these plants are cut, the plant material should be rendered non-viable, and extra care should be taken to avoid spreading this viable plant material throughout the right-of-way or other work site. In areas where invasive plants occur, an attempt should be made to mow the right-of-ways prior to seed maturity. This will prevent those viable seeds from being proliferated and spread throughout the right-of-way. In areas that are heavily infested or areas in proximity to sensitive natural areas, these sites can be prioritized earlier within the mowing season or the mowing schedule to make sure that these seeds never reach maturity and their ability to spread is reduced. Mowing after these seeds have reached maturity obviously will spread throughout the right-of-way and also have the ability to spread these seeds to other sites that the equipment is then scheduled to be transported to. Next slide, Mary. Selective herbicide applications are probably the most common, time-effective, as well as labor-unintensive method of selectively controlling invasive plant populations. These applications should be led by a certified applicator with a license from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. These applications should be timed accordingly to prevent seed maturity and the death of the plant prior to mowing or any other soil disturbance. In one of Mary's early slides, in the introduction, it showed a large tank sprayer and a gentleman spraying an isolated patch of knotweed. When operated in this fashion, it provides municipal staff the opportunity to drive down the right of way and selectively treat invasive species populations, reducing their abundance while keeping the native and desired vegetation populations intact. Next slide, please, Mary. The moving and maintenance of equipment. If work in areas containing invasive plants cannot be avoided, and in many times it cannot, the movement and maintenance of construction equipment should be from areas with low or no existing invasive species populations to species where infestations are known to occur. This will prevent the spread of both seed and viable plant material from areas where invasives occur to areas where they do not occur. Another technique is to locate and use staging areas that are free from invasive plants to avoid spreading seeds and other viable plant materials. If equipment must be used in areas containing invasive plants, another technique is to reduce above ground material through spraying, cutting, or just other proper disposal methods prior to the start of work. Next slide, please. If equipment must be used in areas where invasive plants occur, all equipment, machinery, and hand tools should be clean of heavy soil deposits and plant material before leaving the project site. Equipment should be cleaned at the site of infestation to prevent spread to other sites. Acceptable methods include high pressure air, brush, broom, or other hand tools, or a portable wash station that contains runoff from washing equipment. Next slide, please. In regards to disposal of plant material, when invasive plants are cut or removed for roadside, where are we at? I think, all right, we're going in the wrong direction here. Right there. All right, so when invasive plants are cut or removed for roadside maintenance, construction, or control of vegetation, the viable plant material should be disposed of properly. This can be done so through the use of brush piles where plant materials are piled on site to dry out. Care must be taken to ensure that the cut surface of the plant material does not make contact with the soil. If feasible, the plant material can be buried as well. This is recommended to be done at least 3 feet below grade, and it is best to be done on the site where the materials have been disposed of or taken from. Also, burning is another viable method where plant material should be taken to a designated location or burned on site if possible. Next slide, please. And the disposal of excavated material. I know this ditch digging and the movement of right-of-way material is very common as well. Excavated material taken from sites that contain invasive plant materials should not be used outside of the site where the infestation occurred until all viable plant material is destroyed. Any excavated material that contains viable plant material and is not reused within the limits of the infestation should be stockpiled on an impervious surface until the viable plant material is rendered no longer viable. Soil and other materials containing invasive plants should be covered during transport to prevent their spread from site A to site B. Next slide, please. Limiting soil disturbance and stabilization of erosion-prone sites. We understand that most of the work taking place in the right-of-way is going to create some form of soil disturbance. With that in mind, limiting soil disturbance whenever possible will prevent the establishment of invasive plant species. These species often colonize in areas of soil disturbance, especially where native species have been removed or have been harmed to create a blank slate. It is recommended that in these sites where soil disturbance has occurred, invasive plants or they are monitored for the emergence of invasive plants for a minimum of 2 years after the project has been completed. It is recommended that the stabilization of disturbed soil as soon as possible by seeding and or using mulch, hay, riprap, or gravel that is free of invasive plant material. Seeds of native species should be used whenever possible. Species on the prohibited invasive plant list should never be introduced to these sites. Next slide, please. And finally, the reestablishment of native vegetation. Any plant material introduced to revegetate a site where soil disturbance or vegetation removal has occurred should be native to the region. Local suppliers can often provide a list or recommendations on native seed mixes, seedlings, and tree species. Materials brought onto a site such as fill, loam, mulch, hay, riprap, or gravel should not be brought to a project area from locations where invasive plants are known to occur. Very similar to the sites of disturbance, if the absence of invasive plants cannot be guaranteed, the site should be monitored for a minimum of 2 years for the emergence of invasive plants. In both these sites, where either soil disturbance or the erosion has occurred, or in the situation where materials are brought onto the site, simply hand pulling or the selective herbicide application of new invasives that are emerging are both effective methods to control their spread throughout the site. Thank you.
Okay, does that wrap you up, Tom?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Mary.
Okay, great. Hey, well, yeah, thank you so much to our panelists for all the great information. We did pull together a resources sheet, so I'll share that after the presentation today. We have everyone's email address, so we pulled together some resources on the invasive species that we presented and some just additional information about places to look for the Pennsylvania herbicide applicator forms, and then some other information about identifying and managing invasive species. So we're after 2 already, so apologize a little bit for running late. Are there any questions? If you have any, now would be the time. You can type them in the chat box and we will do our best to answer them. I'm going to switch. We also have our contact information there, so feel free to jot that down and contact us afterwards. We'll also be following up with a link to the recording, and that'll have our contact info as well. So we'll hang on for a minute, see if anyone thinks of any questions. No, I'm not seeing any. Let's see. Okay. So there's one. Is multiflora rose classified as a noxious weed? You want to take that one, Amy?
I'm actually just going to double check to make sure I'm saying the right thing. So I'm going to the noxious weed list right now.
I know there's been some changes to it in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Yeah, the list is available for Pennsylvania on the Department of Agriculture's website.
Right, and I can actually include a link here in the chat. But yes, our multiflora rose is a Class B noxious weed in Pennsylvania currently.
Yeah. Is there any more? Are there any more questions? Right. I'll just wait one more minute, see if there's any last ones. No, we ran a little bit long. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any more, so I guess we'll wrap up. Thank you again so much to our panelists, and thank you to our attendees for listening.